Everyone, and welcome to the second mini lesson out of the government curriculum. Today we're going to focus on two different learning targets, which are both related to different types of government. Our two learning targets for today are I can identify and provide examples of different types of government. So for that one, we're going to look at different types of government that exist in different parts of the world. And then the second one is a little bit more specific, and it states I can compare, contrast, and evaluate models of representation in democratic governments. So the second learning target is specifically focusing on different types of democracies that exist in different parts of the world. So the first term that we're going to review is the term anarchy. By definition, the term anarchy, based off of the Greek roots, means having no ruler. In an anarchy, there either isn't a government that exists or the government has no authority or control over the people, and therefore there's no hierarchy. The concept of an anarchy is connected to freedom, liberty, independence, and self government. People who live in an anarchy have unlimited individual rights. However, history has proven that anarchies don't work. As we have discussed, there's a reason that governments exist. There's a reason that societies naturally form governments, and consequently, they don't last long term. An example of an anarchy in history is the French Revolution, but this too proved to be unsuccessful. The second term we're going to look at is a dictatorship. By definition, a dictatorship is a government with one person in power without constitutional limitations. Dictators generally commit fraud to commit their position. They use intimidation, terror, suppression of civil rights in order to ensure that they remain powerful, and they typically use propaganda to gain supporters. So, propaganda is basically when they are using tactics to trick people into believing that what their ideas are the best ideas in order to gain support. The most popular example of this would be under Hitler in Nazi Germany. However, there have been several other examples throughout history. The next one is a democracy. By definition, a democracy is a government which is ruled by the people. Throughout history, there have been different types of democracies that have formed. The initial type of democracy was considered a direct democracy. This originated in ancient Athens in ancient Greece. In a direct democracy, all citizens are involved in the government and usually come together on a schedule, typically as once a month, to determine all government decisions. In ancient Athens, it was required that all citizens, which were males who were over 18 years of age and were not considered slaves, were required to be a part of government decisions. They could be fined or they could even be put to jail if they did not get involved in their government. Throughout time, direct democracies haven't really worked. For one, it is hard to schedule to have everyone come together and be involved in the government system, because if you're requiring all citizens to become involved, then those citizens have other responsibilities and other jobs within that society, and anytime they're meeting, it's taking away from those additional responsibilities. Additionally, the more people involved in a government, the less agreement there's going to be and the further discussion it's going to lead to, and typically speaking, it proves to be unsuccessful because people cannot come to a final decision and it takes too long to make choices. Consequently, direct democracies soon evolved into a representative democracy. Representative democracy was first found in ancient Rome. It is a government where citizens vote for representatives to handle the legislation. In other words, people get a say in the people who represent them, but those representatives are responsible for making the laws. A constitutional democracy is very similar to a representative democracy. However, in a constitutional democracy, it's based around a constitution. This is what is found in not only the United States, but a majority of the nations that are a part of the United Nations. It is where, again, people are voting for representatives and sometimes are even voting directly for laws, depending on the situation. Democracy is a core ideal of the United Nations, which is the largest international organization. And basically, the United Nations was formed in order to protect democracy. So if individual rights or freedoms are being taken away in one part of the world, then the United Nations will typically get involved, and those countries that are a part of the United Nations will step up and do something about it. The next type is called a monarchy. A monarchy is a government where the head of state is established through hierarchy based on hereditary. It is generally ruled by a king or queen, although other royal positions can be a part of the government. An example of this would be the United Kingdom. At one time, monarchies were very common, especially in European countries. However, over time, they've become very limited. In a lot of governments, including the United Kingdom, there is a monarchy that exists. However, the day to day decisions are made by a parliament, which is a representative government. So, a lot of governments today have a hybrid of different forms of government, and typically those that have a king or queen today, that king or queen has limited power, and instead those responsibilities of carrying out the day-to-day responsibilities of enforcing laws and creating laws is led to a legislative body. An oligarchy is kind of similar to a dictatorship. However, instead of looking at the rule of one person, it's looking at a rule of a few. Typically speaking, the few that are involved in the government are either all a part of the same family or they're all a part of a group of families that have worked together for years. This was very common in ancient Chinese cultures. And usually, the individuals that make up the oligarchy are selected from the elite, and typically, they don't last long term either because they are way too powerful, similar to dictatorship. In modern day examples in Russia. The next example is a republic. So, a republic government is very similar to a democracy. In fact, some political scientists argue that they're basically the same thing. A republic is a government ruled by representatives. This includes a government where citizens, which are the people that make up the country, can vote out individuals out of office if they don't like the choices they're making. So, this is the case in the United States and most countries throughout the world today. In the United States, there are term limits for a majority of political positions. For example, every 4 years we vote for a new president, every 4 years we vote for a new governor, every 4 years we vote for new members of the House of Representatives, and every 6 years we vote for new members of Senate. So if you don't like the decisions that a specific representative or politician is making, then you can vote for someone else in the next election. Or if you don't like the conditions of the country under their rule, then you can select someone in the next election. This was one of the core ideals of the founding fathers, that they wanted to ensure that if the people or the citizens did not like how the country was being run, then they were basically not stuck with that person long term. The next type of government is a theocracy. A theocracy, by definition, is a government where the leaders are either considered divine or religious in nature. So, in a lot of, especially early governments and early civilizations, a theocracy was the type of government they had. For example, in ancient Egypt, it was believed that the pharaohs had direct contact with the gods, and those pharaohs were the rulers of the land. Typically, theocracies also have some sort of religious law that's connected to the government. A modern day example is Saudi Arabia, however, these were very common in ancient civilizations. The next example of a type of government is a military junta. A military junta is a temporary government typically put in state when there is an overthrow of a government, typically by a rebellion or a coup. After this happens, basically history has proven that there is typically a temporary government system put in control, and typically the military has a lot of involvement in that government system. And basically, they're in place until they make a long term decision. An example of a military junta is in Spain in 1808. However, there haven't really been modern day examples of this. The final type of government we're going to look at is socialism. So, socialism is not only looking at the government, but is also looking at the economics within a society. By definition, socialism is an economic and political system based on collective common or public ownership. This sounds great in theory and has a lot of overlap with looking at the anarchy. However, long term, it has proven not to work. An example of this would be historically in Cuba. Basically, within socialist governments, people tend to either take advantage of the fact that there's no real way to enforce laws, or they become too powerful and start to overthrow the government. So the next one is not necessarily a type of government, but it's a level of government. So tribal governments is something we're going to be talking about a little bit later on in the curriculum. But I want to emphasize that tribal governments, especially tribal governments in the United States, each have their own government, and generally that government has formed their own constitution. While there are similarities in values and laws and basically policies in different tribal governments throughout the United States, these governments and constitutions are separate, and many date prior to European exploration in the late 1400s. Within these tribal governments, it is typically their responsibility to provide for things like first responders, including police as well as ambulances, education systems, so typically they have their own school, and healthcare systems. So, an example would be the Native American tribes throughout the United States. However, there are tribal governments in other parts of the world as well. So, overall, those just provide different types of government that exist in different parts of the world. For the most part, the government curriculum is focused around the United States government, but it is important to acknowledge that the United States government is unique in that the laws that we're talking about, the Constitution we're talking about, may relate to other governments. However, ultimately, every government makes their own choices, and depending on the type of government, they may even have different types of leadership.